Okay, so this is the EMANES. EMANES stands for Euro-Mediterranean African Network for Economic Studies. This is our annual conference for 2023. And our topic this year is about novel approaches for regional partnerships in the Euro-Mediterranean and Africa. So this topic this year has been quite important for practically looking at the context overall globally, which we are experiencing a lot of fragmentations. And I think regional partnerships nowadays are becoming quite important for geopolitics and also for geoeconomics, especially for the region, the Euro-Mediterranean and Africa, where historically there has been a lot of cooperation and also economic partnerships where, in fact, if we look at the stocktake, the regional stocktake over the last, say, decades, it has not really produced convergence, economic convergence. So still the South Mediterranean and Africa and North Mediterranean and Europe, they are quite divergent in terms of economic development. Of course, the global pandemic that we experienced globally and followed by the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and also the wave of inflation that we've seen did not help the situation at all economically. And clearly there is a need to rethink regional approaches for regional partnerships. And here I can take stock of what the European Union has been doing. I think Europe, in a way, has a lot to do in this partnership. But not only this, also the African Union, the Union for Mediterranean, and all these institutions, which in fact have institutionally a role to move this regional partnerships, because at the end, only isolation, economic isolation, will not help any part of this region. So this conference, as you could see, it's organized over 3 days. Today is the first day, which we start with a keynote speech by Professor Giovanni Ferri. Giovanni, he's a member of the advisory board of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association. He's professor at LUMSA University and also has been very much active in the research on economic development, but also on sustainability. And this conference really is a connection between academia and policy, and really at the end trying to get some new ideas for regional partnership in the region. So what we call novel approaches to regional integration in Europe, Mediterranean, and Africa, it's really trying to push further in terms of cooperation and development and co-development at the same time. I think this is much more complex if we would like to really think win-win, changing the rhetoric which has been there for years. Now, if we look at Europe, what has been happening over the years, Europe has been moving now to what we call the digital integration. Actually, there is even a new law on artificial intelligence, which has been approved, and this is quite important for the development in artificial intelligence at EU level. Of course, Europe is quite integrated at the north side. And I think for this digital integration, which I see it's something new and needs to be much more researched, not only from the academic side, but also from the policy side, it's really leveraging on completely new technologies, not only on the financial side, but also on the infrastructural side. And this will also enhance very much cross-border services and e-governance. And this is also important to keep in mind that we still know a little bit on digital integration and convergence. We just don't know it. Of course, there is a lot of efforts to regulate because a lot we don't know. So when we try regulating, it's really to cap to certain manner the development. The second one, which we know a little bit more, and we have experienced this, for example, during the war in Ukraine, is the energy union. Clearly, there is a lot to do there. Now, Europe has been very much in the forefront in terms of the Green Deal of the European Union, so trying to focus on sustainable, secure, and affordable energy, including very much renewable energy, so the phasing out from fossil fuel. Actually, the team, last week we were in COP28 in Dubai, and there is a lot of debate about this phasing out from fossil fuel. Europe is forefront on this. They would like to move into a clear, explicit phasing out of fossil fuel, but many countries, especially, for example, the exporting countries of oil and gas, they are resistant to this, including, for example, Arabia Saudi or other countries in the OPEC. The third one, which I think we have done a lot in terms of integration and convergence in the banking and financial union in the European Union. And this has been really strengthening the financial sector overall with the banking union. But still, there is a lot to do in terms of the capital market union. And these are that we are still looking at novel approaches on how to advance the capital market union. But if we look at the regional integration within the European Union, this is not really spread across the borders. I mean, with the neighborhood countries, there are many agreements, like, for example, accession agreements, or, for example, neighborhood policy, or, for example, the Barcelona process for the Mediterranean countries, but it did not really work. And we have a lot of evidence in the research we have been doing at the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, but also in the EMANES in the time before, including the Africa. So EMANES was the Euro-Mediterranean Economist Network for Economic Studies. Clearly, the Barcelona process did not yield the results we were expecting. And nowadays, we need to rethink the partnership with the Mediterranean, between Europe and the Mediterranean, where there is much more, I would say, value creation and transfer of, for example, knowledge and movement of people, capital, and services and goods. So if I look at the Mediterranean, basically looking at the geographical dimension, there is an economy emerging. It has been emerging for many years, and this is the blue economy. I mean, we have done a lot of research at the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association on the blue economy, and Yagane here has been working on this on these dimensions within the regional economy of the Mediterranean. And the whole idea is, since we are the Mediterranean Sea, it's between Europe and Africa, and there is a large economy there, which is also impacted by the climate change, and there is a need to have more mitigation and more adaptation, and also preservation of the biodiversity. There are many marine and maritime sectors, including fisheries, tourism, and also energy, which have been developing over time. But still, it does not include really very forcefully the preservation of biodiversity of the ecosystem, and also the ecosystem services that could be valued to ensure that there is mitigation of climate change. And beyond this, also the adaptation to climate change, because in fact, the Mediterranean is a hotspot, and countries alone cannot really do much without having this collaborative thinking and regional thinking together. So this is also one aspect which I think researchers will have to do a little bit more to better understand how we could develop, in fact, regional partnership in the blue economy. The second one, of course, and this comes naturally to the collaboration between Europe and the Mediterranean, is the Mediterranean Renewable Energy Cooperation. Of course, there is a lot I would say, to collaborate in terms of that renewable energy supply and also demand from the European side. And focusing on developing the infrastructure for renewable energy between Mediterranean, Africa, and Europe is essential to have credible strategies to phase out from fossil fuel. And this is not happening yet. Of course, there's a lot of investments going on in this sector, but yet we can see the development going very, very, I would say, not in the speed that we would like to see to comply with the 1.5 global warming targets, which is the Paris Agreement. And clearly, looking at the reports from the IPCC and other reports from scientific community, it's very difficult to reach the target, means that global warming is a reality. The extreme events in the Mediterranean region and globally is going up, which means that there is a potential for destruction of value, economic value, but at the same time, the extreme events are going up. They cannot be insured anymore by the private sector. It means that the countries themselves, they will have to start thinking of disaster management. And this disaster management should be also a focus and a target for regional cooperation in the Mediterranean, at least, but beyond the Mediterranean, between Europe, Mediterranean, and Africa. And this because all of this region is under a stress in terms of climatic challenges. The third aspect that we have been working on, and I think this is also one novel approach, is the cultural and educational exchanges with artificial intelligence, with the possibility to do more virtually. There is really a potential for strengthening ties through shared cultural heritage. I mean, the Mediterranean is a place for diverse cultural heritage. And also already there is a lot of cooperation in terms of research, in terms of education, in terms of exchange. I mean, I think we need to foster this collaboration more, regional partnership more, to also connect with the labor market. And this labor market that is changing nowadays, particularly with the changes of the, I would say, the measures within it. So this is also something that we could work on as researchers, and it's priority areas in terms of policy for Europe and the Mediterranean. Africa is also essential in our in our thinking for regional partnership and cooperation. Of course, there has been the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which the idea was to create a single market for goods and services to boost the intra-African trade. But this is, in fact, I view it as a reference model for integration. We need to think much more sustainably for adaptation strategies to climate change in Africa, and also mitigation. Of course, mitigation is much more an area where Europe has to be going much faster. But for Africa, still, we're talking about adaptation to climate change. And here there is a potential for more regional cooperation between Europe, Mediterranean, and Africa, but still more research is needed to allow us to have much more informed assessments on what's going on in that area. Second, which is linked to the first, is the African infrastructure development. I mean, Africa needs more electrification. It's one of the continents where there is the least electrification. So investment in, I would say, in infrastructure of electricity infrastructures, but also in roads, railways, and hospitals, healthcare, and schools and universities. Still, there is a huge potential in Africa to allow this convergence in a way. So we have developed a regional integration matrix, which will be presented tomorrow by my colleague Elena. And this has allowed us really to understand that for regional integration, there are different pillars that we need to focus on. Of course, not all pillars have the same, I would say, weight. We have been mainly for many years focusing on trade of goods and services, investment, also finance. But there are others that we need to work on, particularly when we are focusing on the African continent. So these are all aspects which, in my view, will have to be looked at very carefully, while adding horizontally the sustainability dimensions, which are part of the SDGs 2030. Of course, we are very soon reaching 2030, and many countries have not achieved the targets that they have been, I would say, promising to achieve. So we are already thinking about post-2030, SDGs 2030. Probably the SDGs will have to be revisited also very carefully to make it a little bit much more focused on sectors, focused on the ground. And this, again, we need more research to inform the policymakers for this. So the last area, which we've seen, again, based on the research we have done, not only in EMANES, but also in EMEA, is during the pandemic, many African countries have not been prepared to deal with the pandemic. So they have been really, in a way, receiving vaccines from many other countries as a kind of a support for them to deal with the pandemic. So e-health initiatives are essential, particularly when with the development of digital technologies, we could aspire to improve the healthcare access, delivery, and also connect remote areas. I think nowadays with digital transformations that we are experiencing, and also with with all the connections that we have, more infrastructure, digital infrastructure in Africa is essential, also connected to the health initiative, what I call regional health initiative. I think the African Union, together with the European Union, could put a target for that, and it's also an area of collaboration. But beyond also these initiatives, I would always remind that there should be a transfer of technologies. I think it's a time has come to ensure that there is a kind of, I would say, partnership, but not only, I would say, aid for trade, as it has been in years. Aid for trade in reality did not work. And we need to really rethink even the concept of aid and make sure that every, I would say, financial contribution, which is given by any stakeholder, should produce the value expected or expected value to ensure that this is an investment. So every dollar or euro which is invested in the continent should bring value to the continent, back to the continent. And I think the concept even of aid need to be rethought completely. So these are aspects which, in fact, we would like to shift what I call the reference model that has been there for years into more inclusive, sustainable, and technologically driven integration strategies. So these technologically driven strategies will allow us to have much more transparency, much more evidence-based, much more science-based approaches for integration, rather than political versus, agreements which are very not easily evidenced over time. So these are all aspects that we are very much interested to hear from the researchers, and in the evaluation of the papers that we have selected in this conference, we focused on those aspects very much. As you could see, the program is a combination between policy and academic research, but at the same time, also we are trying to encourage young researchers to work on these aspects of research that is really relevant for the regions. So I want to say a few words about the regional partnerships in climate mitigation and adaptation. Since we've been in COP28 last week, I don't see much cooperation integration in that space. I think, yes, there is a lot of talks, but yet we need to have a full strategy, a comprehensive strategy for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Developing countries, they need much more adaptation than mitigation. And I think this is also something that needs to be discussed with the countries themselves. But collaborative efforts, solidarity mechanisms, And also guarantees and co-guarantees could be one way to exit from I would say, the huge challenges that climate change is putting on those countries. So beyond as I said, the renewable energy projects, which can be centralized or decentralized, depending on the investments in this field. But I think a financial deal is essential to ensure that those countries have the capacity to, in fact, adapt to climate change. There has been the agreement in the Loss and Damage Fund, which is a global fund nowadays. Up to today, this Loss and Damage Fund, it's up to 800 million, which has been agreed in Dubai. But it's not enough. It's really the first step to ensure that there is this solidarity, global solidarity mechanisms, which in fact have been agreed since last year. Another thing is also for dealing with climate change and also connecting this to the preservation and conservation of the nature. More research and technology transfer is needed between the different sides, Europe, Mediterranean, Africa, and globally. Joint research initiatives on climate change adaptation mitigation technologies, this is essential, and we need much more of that. And then, of course, researchers are very much encouraged to work on climate change mitigation and adaptation. I know sometimes researchers are constrained to publish in high ranked academic journals for their career development. But I think the time in our disposal has to be used as much efficiently as possible to ensure that also we are responding to societal challenges. Another area which in fact will become top on the agenda going forward is the disaster preparedness and responses. Who is going to fund this disaster preparedness? Who is going to respond? The speed of response. And knowing that clearly evidence shows that the insurance and reinsurance market is exiting from all this, I would say, risky areas. Like, for example, we've seen the heat waves, the droughts, the floods, and any other disaster that we've seen the frequency going up. In many private companies, they will not insure that risk, or the cost of insurance and reinsurance will go up. More investment and green financing is needed. There is now a market globally for ESG compliant financial instrument. I think it's reaching practically 4 trillion, but we see also some resistance from many countries, like, for example, the US and other countries. So it's also, again, important to collect data and to do research to understand a bit more the performance of this ESG type of compliant instruments to accelerate the green transition and to work together, in fact. So to work together in a collaborative way and trying really to share the risks and the risk, the overall risk overall. So I think there are many other aspects that I would like to spend a bit of time on, but during the 3 days we have the possibility to discuss. With this, I would like to, without further ado, give the floor to our keynote speaker, Professor Giovanni Ferri. Giovanni has done a lot of work on sustainability, and I give you the floor, Giovanni.
Thank you very much, Rim. It is a great pleasure to be here with you and with this distinguished group of people who are either present here in this room or connected via Zoom. My speech will be in line with what you introduced, Rim, in the sense that I will be talking about looking ahead from the poly crisis to responsibility and adaptation in the future of Europe and Africa. And in particular, what I will be outlining is the poly crisis. It's a jargon that has been diffused in the last couple of decades, where different crises have been not replacing each other, but adding to each other. And with that in mind, polycrisis is about the environment, polycrisis is about the social aspects, polycrisis has become a crisis of big conflicts that are becoming more and more intense and more widespread across the world. And not only those conflicts that we consider from this snapshot in Europe, where we are certainly more attentive to the wars that are close to Europe, but there are wars everywhere in the world, almost everywhere. And Africa is a continent where conflicts have become increasingly endemic, not to mention the Middle East. So the poly crisis is certainly including many different dimensions, but of course I have to tell you what I know better, and I will particularly address the issue of sustainability, also in line with what Rim was saying at the beginning. So I will briefly show, after showing you what the poly crisis may be, putting some notions together in the sense that you probably know everything that I'm going to lay out on the table, but maybe not always all of us think and see how the puzzle fits together. And this is something that we need to increasingly learn to do, using systemic approaches in order to understand where the world is going, where different regions are going. But having observed that, which I will do in the first 5 or 10 minutes, then I will go briefly to the origin of the sustainable thinking from the introduction of the Earth Day in the early 1970s up until the SDGs, which is the current wave of sustainable thought. After giving some details about that, I will ask where do we stand in terms of reaching the objectives, the goals that are these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And it is time to take stock on that because, you know, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were launched in 2015, so they were valid from 2016 until 2030. And here we are in 2023, it's just midway between 2016 and 2030. We are in the middle of the time in which those goals should be achieved. And we all know that few of them will be achieved, if any. In spite of that, the good news is that Europe is exercising a significant leadership in the sustainable transition. And again, I'm not saying anything new, but I will try to provide some additional details to that claim. And after seeing that, I will take a little detour by stressing something that we discussed in a webinar with organized by EMEA in conjunction with the COP28, which is the different approach to the sustainable transition between the European Union and the United States. This is a partial view because, of course, the world is increasingly complex and the BRICS have become reality. There are new countries that are important in the global governance, but still, even though Europe is becoming less important in terms of GDP or however you want to measure it, in terms of population, definitely. And also the US in some ways is retrenching, but these are the two major blocks still that may exercise a guidance. I'm not saying that it is a good guidance, it might be bad, but they are exercising a guidance. So what is different, as I will show you, is the difference that we all know there is a big difference between the common law on the one hand and the civic law on the other hand. And there is a regulatory approach in Europe. There is rules should be for everything. And instead, in the US, they tend, the Anglo-American approach, they tend to have an approach in which the market should choose. And as I will argue, this it's good to have the market choose, but sometimes when you are facing a time in which you need to change rapidly, maybe the markets are not perceiving that way. So the role of the state, of the public authorities, is important. And then I will come to Africa, because I have to talk about Europe, the Mediterranean, and Africa. And I will look together with you to how Africa is the continent that, in spite of having participated the least in determining many of the aspects of this polycrisis, is suffering the most out of the polycrisis. And I will particularly focus on climate migration, which is a phenomenon that is going to have epochal dimensions. And there is very little that can be done to rule that out. And I'm talking about you, not me, because I will not be there, but you will have to govern this process. The sooner you understand the ramifications and the implications of this massive wave of displaced people for the continent itself, the African continent, for the Mediterranean countries, and for Europe, which will have to deal with it no matter what, the sooner the better. Finally, taking responsibility towards concerted adaptation. Why is that? As I will show you, and as you probably already know, but you have again to build the puzzle by assembling the single pieces and then look at the big picture. As far as we know, if you do not stand with the anti-science thinkers, it is the greenhouse gases that are causing the climate crisis. This is a man-made phenomenon, and most of it is CO2. Now, where is the CO2 coming from? This is a good question, because we all know that the contribution to CO2 has been dramatically different across the world. And unfortunately, since we are talking about this, the contribution has been the highest by the developed countries, by the rich countries, with differences even within the rank of the rich countries. Certainly, the African regions that are receiving the harshest consequences of the climate crisis did not contribute much to producing CO2, and yet they bear the consequences. So this is an issue of what is right, which goes beyond what is efficient. And we are increasingly these days, these years, these decades being asked to step back from a purely efficientistic reasoning towards something which is more humane and consider who is responsible and what can we do for our brothers and sisters. So the polycrisis. I mean, I'm putting together some pieces of evidence that you all know, just to give some common background. We know that there is a reduction in the glacier thickness between 1955 and 2010, and I stopped early. I'm not taking the latest years because situation is even worse. But was already known for a few years now. The average thickness of the glaciers dropped by 14 meters between 1955 and 2010. And that caused, of course, a problem for some biodiversity, which has been lost. Think of the white bear, for instance. They are not lost, but they are endangered. As a result, but what was causing that the melting of the ice? Of course, it was the global warming. The global warming until now is maybe less than 1 degree, approximately not much more than 1 degree centigrade. And the projections are out there. They may reach plus 5 degrees by 2100. As a consequence of the melting ice, you have rising sea levels. We do not notice, but people in Polynesia, they notice. People in Bangladesh, they notice. People in Indonesia, they notice. You know that Indonesia has decided to move the capital because it will be inundated by the sea. And the same will happen to Dhaka. It will have to be moved. Millions, tens of millions of people will have to be relocated. But it's not only a smooth factor, a smooth crisis. There is extreme weather events are becoming more and more frequent. If you look at these numbers that you find here in this top left graph, you see that the tornadoes were not common in Europe, and they have become common in Europe. If you measure the total numbers back in the 1950s, there was approximately 4 tornadoes all over the world per year. And in 2014, when I stopped collecting the data because it's going up to the sky, there were already 17. I'm sorry, not 17, but 25. And look at, and the extreme weather events are one of the erratic forms in which the climate crisis is manifesting itself, because you have inundations, but at the same time you have droughts. So as a result of this, of the changing patterns of the rains, you have that the availability of drinking water has become a critical aspect, much more than in the past. And as a result of that, there are increasing conflicts for water. Back in the 1950s, you had less than one conflict, one active conflict for water a year. In 1914, you had 17 conflicts for water that were active. And many of the conflicts that we can think of, including the Syrian one, can be motivated also by water. The Darfur one, in many different situations, you find that the seeking to secure the possession of water is at least a co-motivation, if not the main motivation. Now, but because of the erraticity in the erratic rain cycles, and also because of the wrong use of water for irrigation, you have had that lakes are disappearing. The news of last week was that one of a big lake in Iran has disappeared, has become dry. And this is the Aral, the Lake Aral, which was the largest lake in Asia. It was in the Asian part of Russia. If you see the picture on the down to the left, it was the first half was taken from the sky in September 1989, and look at less than 20 years were enough to cause almost the disappearance of that lake. And indeed, you see that there is a ship which cannot navigate any longer. But the poly crisis is not just because about the environment, and I'm not certainly citing all the aspects of the environmental crisis. It's much about society. We are moving from one financial disaster to another. We are moving from a societal disaster to another. And look at these covers that I took from the Economist. The first one is about the crisis, the global financial crisis, nowhere to hide. It is as if there were lightning coming from the sky, hitting the investors and the brokers. And then we had the sovereign crisis in Europe. But it's not only that, there is a big issue of inequality that is becoming increasingly present, not only in poor countries and in middle-income countries and in emerging economies, but also in the rich countries. And you see that, again, the Economist is capturing that by telling you that there is a guy at the top of the skyscraper, the tallest skyscraper, and the other guy is escalating up, and he also has got a stair, but nothing to do. He'll never catch up with the other guy. So the moment you realize that your effort is not enough to compensate for your point of departure, you realize that there is something unjust, that the game is not fair. And maybe you get upset. And you may get even more upset than that if you learn that in the largest democracy of the world, which is the United States, that according to its constitution should give equal opportunity to everybody. If you want to go to a good, send your children to a good school, you have to pay maybe $100,000 per year. Who can afford that? Only the rich. So you see why George Washington has become redrafted by the Economist to be not the man of freedom, but the man of richness. And the problem, the rage of this person who knows that he will never make up increases when he observes that even his children will never make up because he cannot send his children to the top schools. But then there is a third aspect, that much of the richness across the world goes to these places where people don't pay taxes. And if they don't pay taxes, there will be no social security for the poor people. There will be no emergency rooms that are open when you need them, and things like that. So people get really upset. And society becomes at risk. You may see, this is the famous elephant picture that represents how much was of the effect of growth was captured by the top 1%, as you see. So you have more inequality overall across the countries. And the only good news is that there is less inequality across countries, but there is little satisfaction in knowing that, because you know that inequality is within the countries. So each society is damaged by lack of equality and increasing inequality. And this picture I took from the World Economic Forum, the Global Risk Perception Survey 22-23. As you see here, you have different regions. Here you have the asset bubble burst, so the financial crisis. Here you have the environmental damage, which is green. Here you have the health problems with, of course, you will have the pandemic. Here you have the technological factors that may also cause inequality. Here you have the interstate conflicts and collapse of the state, the area of conflicts. And natural disasters are here, the proliferation of illicit economic activity, the collapse of a system important supply chain that we have seen with the advent of the pandemic first, and later on with the war in Ukraine that damaged severely the global value chain. I guess there will be much more discussion in the sessions to come about this. And sometimes this situation degenerates into wars. And here you have the map of the world with the wars that were active back in 2000, 23 years ago. And if you look at this, you see that here you have war, violent crisis, limited or no violence. There were wars in Colombia. There were wars in 3 or 4 African states. There was war within the Russian area. The other crises were not, strictly speaking, wars. And look at how the situation has evolved or involved in 2023. Africa has become massacred by increasing numbers of conflicts. And it is particularly in this continent that wars have concentrated. And this map was drawn before Gaza. So there is little hope that if we meet again next year, we will have a better situation. We all hope, I wish, that the situation will evolve in a positive manner. Little guarantee. Okay, let me move on because I think I'm using too much time. What was done over the decades? First of all, what are the key dates? This is useful for us to remind that the first action by the United Nations was in 1972 when the first UN Earth Summit was held in Stockholm, and the Earth Day started there in that year. And then if we jump 15 years later, in 1987, we have the Brundtland Report on our common future, which gave the first definition and still accepted the definition of what is a sustainable development. And in 1992, 5 years later, there was a lot of optimism because the Earth Summit moved to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and it started the Agenda 21. And Rio de Janeiro is not the capital of Brazil, is not the biggest city of Brazil, but it is in our common imagination, the Brazilian city. And if you think of Brazil, it means that you are thinking about the Amazon forests, and which has been and still is, even though much damaged by speculation, the largest forest in the world. So it's particularly important for the environment. And 5 years later, the Kyoto Protocol on climate change was signed in Japan. And this was a very important turning point, because if that had been ratified everywhere and made applicable everywhere, probably we would be in a better situation now. In 2000, the Millennium Development Goals were introduced. In 2002, there was a World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, which was also called Rio +10. And in 2012, another time, the World Summit was held in Rio. It was called Rio +20. Also, the report was issued there, The Future We Want, which was at the basis for the 2030 agenda that would be later approved in 2015 with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And also the COP21, which was very important in Paris, still in the same year, in 2015. I wish to mention that in 2015, also Pope Francis issued an important note towards sustainability, which was called the encyclical letter Laudato Si, which means be praised, you be praised, in which he didn't speak to the Catholics, he didn't speak to the Christians only, he spoke to, he didn't speak to people who believe in God only, he spoke to the entire people of the world. So what happened in 1972? In 1972, a very influential book was published. It was called The Limits to Growth. We are talking about 51 years ago. The book was committed to the systemic group analysis. A group of scientists at MIT, it was the Club of Rome that had been founded 5 years earlier, 4 years earlier only, in 1968. And the Club of Rome was not about playing golf, it was about thinking of how to make development sustainable. It was launched by a visionary, Aurelio Peccei, who is not well studied, who is not well known, particularly in Italy, because, you know, there is a say, not only in Italy, but everywhere, you cannot be prophet in your own country. And but what did this book say? It said that if we didn't do enough, if we didn't change the development model, the world would risk ending up against the constraints of limited resources. We might have again pandemics. Is that true? We might have increasing social stress. Is that true? And the world was in danger. Now, what happened after that? Not enough. I'm not saying nothing, but certainly not enough. Actually, I belong to the profession of the economists, and my profession has been responsible for saying no problem. The problem of limited resources can be solved through technical innovation. Technical innovation will lead us everywhere. This has repeatedly proved to be wrong. And you know that if you think about this, you realize that humanity cannot take the risk of making a mistake of this macroscopic level, which, if you wish, was the message of Hans Jonas, the German philosopher who founded the thought of a philosophical thought of sustainability back in the 60s. So anyhow, the United Nations reacted to the publication of this book that was very influential at the time. And they set up the United Nations Environmental Program, and they based it in Nairobi, not in Stockholm, which was a bold move, if you think. And then in 1987, I already said, there was this publication. Brundtland she's still alive as far as I know. Gro Harlem Brundtland is a lady. She was the first female prime minister of Norway in 1981, almost at the same time as Mrs. Thatcher in the UK. And after doing that job as prime minister, she was given this responsibility of chairing this World Commission on Environment and Development. And the Commission in 1987 came up with this definition: humanity has the ability to make development sustainable to ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So the idea is that of the cycle of life. We are the masters of our generation. We are the masters of the world, but somebody will come after us, our children and grandchildren, and we have to be responsible to them. Now, there is another way which is even more effective that you can find in a common statement, in a say by the American Indians. And it says, we do not inherit Earth from our parents, we borrow Earth from our children. And if you look at that, it changes the perspective. Because if you inherited something, at least at that moment you inherited your house or your car, it is yours. You can decide. Then it takes a moral consideration, okay, but I have to leave something to those who come after me. But if instead you borrow from the future, it is a totally different situation. You cannot do whatever you want. You have to pay back the debt. Okay? And another statement, and then we move on, there has been a growing realization in from the report, there has been a growing realization in national governments and multilateral institutions that it is impossible to separate economic development issues from environment issues. Many forms of development erode the environmental resources upon which they must be based, and environmental degradation can undermine economic development. Now, last week, S&P rating agency came out with an estimate of a loss of approximately between 4 and 5% of GDP by 2050 if we do not take measures to avoid the consequences of the climate crisis. This is something that you know, from 8 Millennium Development Goals, we moved to 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But what maybe is not familiar to everybody is that we are not only multiplying by 2 or more the number of the goals, but we are introducing a metric that will be important and is being important in order to measure the footprint, the sustainable footprint. So you can think of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the agenda as a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, you have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. At the mid-level, you have 169 sub-goals or targets. And at the bottom, you have 248 indicators. Now, most of the targets are measurable, quantifiable. Almost all of the indicators at the bottom of the pyramid are quantifiable. So then you can measure. This is the big difference with respect to the Millennium Development Goals. And then let me move on rapidly to measuring the progress. This is the situation in in Europe. You see that there is a monitoring report by Eurostat, and you can see that some of the Sustainable Development Goals were faring relatively well. When they are beyond this line, there is a significant progress. When they are below this line, there is moderate movement away. So this is a really problematic area. This is moderate problematic area because not enough achievement is being done. This is good. Alas, unfortunately, you find that the top performer was peace SDG 16. And I don't know what will happen in 2023, okay? And certainly, judging from the World Sustainable Development Report, you can see that there was moderate progress. The top performer was Europe, and we will come to that in a minute. but even North America and South America, part of Asia, Oceania, joined in making somewhat progress towards the SDGs. Now there is a problem in Africa, part of Latin America. In Africa, only Algeria and Tunisia were good performers. The other countries were laggards according to this data. South Asia, not good. And of course, the countries that are attracting the world events, including the COP, were not good performers. Probably they have not improved much until today. Now, let me show you some detail on Europe's leadership in the sustainable transition. I suspect most of us are very familiar with this. This is what was done with the European Green Deal. This was the trajectory, the former trajectory for decarbonization in Europe, which should have led from taken as 100 the CO2 issued in 1990. By 2017, we were already at 78% due to increasing efficiency of the engines, increasing efficiency in warming our houses and things like that. So there was a reduction in the production of CO2 emissions in the EU by 22%. This was the latest data available in 2019 when the European Green Deal was launched. But since then, the former target was to reach a reduction of 40% from 100 to 60 by 2030, and a reduction to 20 from 100 to 20, so a reduction of 80% by 2050. The new target instead said that by 2050, we want to decarbonize fully. So no net emissions of CO2. And also by 2030, this is even probably unrealistic that Europe will be able to respect this. It should drop down to 45, which means a reduction of 55% with respect to the level of emissions of 1990. This is the same as before. So this time you can notice that the darkest blue, which is achievement of the SDGs beyond 80%, were all in Europe. The Nordic countries, ça va sans dire, and France, Germany. Strangely enough, Poland, the Czech Republic, Austria, and the UK, and the Baltic countries. And those were the leaders, together with Denmark as well. You cannot see Denmark from the map of Europe, but you can see Denmark from Groenlandia because it is it is a bigger spot. And instead, the other southern European countries plus the Benelux, according to this map, were laggards a little bit with respect to the others, but still you have a good blue color. And the rest of the world we already commented. Also, 19 of the top 20 performers in 2022 in terms of achieving the SDGs were from Europe. The only country, the only non-European country was Japan in 19th position. And even if you want to judge how close a continent or a country is to being sustainable by taking the race to net zero, which is decarbonization, you can notice that the degree of decarbonization is relatively faster in Europe, and most of these countries are either European or things like or like that, whereas and you can also notice by the colors. Let me come to the different approach of the European Union with respect to the US. As I mentioned, against the urgency of introducing the green transition and the sustainable transition in economy and society, you can have different approaches. One is the regulatory approach, in which everybody will be in some way induced to adopt the transition. And the other approach is the voluntaristic approach, the optional approach that postulates that market mechanisms and incentives should be enough. Now, I wish we could rely always on market mechanisms, because markets are certainly more efficient when they do solve problems. Unfortunately, we have been trained also to think of market failures. Sometimes the markets are not there when you have to solve some important problems, and therefore you need to rely on public interventions or on institutional interventions that are outside the market. They may complement the market. It's not against the market, it's in favor. Now look at this. The situation of the US in terms of emissions of CO2 compared to Europe is this is per capita. It's not, it's size independent. If you look at the US and Europe, this is the world. Europe is doing its job in a sense, not enough, but it is leading the decarbonization. The US is lagging behind. And one of the big problems with the transition in the US was that even though they approved the Kyoto Protocol in 1987, as you know, it was in Europe, the Kyoto Protocol was applied. We have a market for rights to issue CO2, and it is not, and sometimes it is said that it is not efficient, this market, but something is done there. Now, the US never ratified the protocol, and that is a problem. This regulatory approach was also important in terms of introducing an obligation for companies to start doing sustainability disclosure, non-financial reporting. In the case of Europe, the non-financial reporting directive was introduced in 2014, and it has been reinforced by the currently this directive, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is in the phase of enforcement now. But even before the enforcement of NFRD, if you look at how much reporting, sustainability reporting there was by listed companies in the US and Europe, you realize that GRI, for instance, the Global Reporting Initiative, is the standard for doing sustainability reporting around the world. It was much more intense in Europe, the yellow data, and also when it was done, on average the score was better. So the quality of the report, sustainability reporting that was done, was better. So it's maybe not only due to the regulations, but there is a kind of vocation of the Europeans to that has become entrenched in the minds of the people towards sustainability. Also, look at this. This is the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, which was issued in March 2018, 1 year and 9 months before the European Green Deal was approved. So it means that it was planned to get the results. And this action plan, of course, we can find a lot of problems with it. The taxonomy, which has been approved for the environment, and many of us do not agree on each of the details of the taxonomy. But of course, we have a problem in the sense that we don't have a social taxonomy in acts, and we are lacking other taxonomies. But that is the way to go. This was the first step. And hopefully this will go on, the process will go on. Otherwise, if we leave it to the market, I'm afraid little will be done. And as a matter of fact, the fact that the European effort is paying off is also testified by the fact that the ESG, you know, environmental, social, governance, ESG has become the measure of performance according to the new paradigm of sustainable development. If you compare the USA with the Nordics, certainly there is a big difference, but even Europe is 23% higher in terms of average levels of ESG. And we are talking about otherwise comparable listed companies. We are not talking about apples and pears. And this is a huge competitive advantage. Let me come towards the end, and let me come to the part where it's more perspective oriented. Africa's great exposure to the poly crisis. What do we mean by that? First of all, if I zoom what we saw earlier in terms of conflicts, you can see that Africa is the continent where conflicts have become more numerous and more endemic. And being it civil war or being it terrorist insurgency, and or being it other forms of civil war and terrorist insurgency together, almost the entire continent is in trouble. And when you have wars, when you have conflicts, this means that the problem has escalated to a level in which, first of all, you have to recover peace, because if you don't have peace, what type of sustainable development are we talking about? But Africa is the region of the world that suffers the most in terms of the negative consequences of the global climate crisis. The CO2 is increasing temperatures everywhere, and you can feel that this is not winter. We are in winter here. We should be, I mean, the 13th of December, which is Saint Lucy, according to the tradition, is the shortest day. It's not, because it's the 21st, of course, as we know. But it was a cold day when I was young here. have grown up more or less at the same latitude as here. And this is not winter. Anyhow, but the situation is hardest in Africa because you already have there higher temperature. And if you increase by 1 degree in close to the equator or in the desertic area, the consequences are dramatically different. And what you see here is this red area is the area in which the Sahara is going south. It is taking a tour. Desertification is progressing. And desertification is probably the largest cause of climate migrants, generating a lot of climate migrants. Now, then these climate migrants, according to the OECD, 95% of the climate migrants remain in the slums in the big cities of their country, where they migrate from the villages where it's no longer possible to live. And only 3 to 5% take the boat to come to Europe. And when they arrive here, our governments tell them, we don't want you. It's true. You cannot take everybody who comes. There are limits to solidarity. There are practical limits to hospitality. But can we really tell them that it is their problem? Maybe not. And here I come to the last part. First of all, the size of the climate refugee. According to the International Organization on Migration, according to their estimates, by 2050, there will be from a minimum of 200 billion to a maximum of 1 billion climate migrants. Many of these will come from Africa. And then you have to ask, if somebody wants to think it's their problem, we have to show to this person this map. Where was the CO2 generated? The CO2 is at the origin of the climate crisis, is at the origin of the intensification of the situation of desertification and of climate migration. And look at this. This is CO2 emissions cumulative from 1750. And you can see that the US was the largest responsible, after which you have Russia and China. And then comes Europe. And other countries around the world, but nothing here. Almost no CO2 was produced where it is hitting the most. So if I can go back to this slide, we cannot tell those people it's none of our business, because we contributed to cause that situation, and maybe we have the technologies and the abilities to help them out. And this is what we need to do. There will be no peace with this size of dislocation of people if we do not take this problem seriously. Also because if you look at per capita emissions, the situation is even worse. And this is the share of global cumulative CO2 emissions, of course, at the beginning, there was only the UK because the Industrial Revolution started there. And then later on, you had the European countries and then the United States, as you see, and then China and India. These are the major contributors. But the European Union has started climbing down much earlier than the United States. And China and India are going up still. So this will cause a lot of problems that we have to hope they will be solved in a diplomatic way through negotiations. And this was the situation before COP28. Probably there will be an increase in the loss and damage, but I don't know. I haven't seen the declarations of COP28. But based on what was true before, we had a lot of rules that were agreed in the past that can drive negotiations. We need to build a diplomacy around this big problem. And the European Union has to be generous also in providing support and in helping those countries, the young people of those countries that are going to be hit by these problems even more severely than they are now, to find ways to adapt. It is possible with the new technologies to do something. We have the ability to take, to extract water from air, for instance, which is fantastic solution for avoiding desertification. But at the end of the day, technology without a human insight and a human heart, technology cannot be guided by artificial intelligence. It has to have a human heart. So we need to do much more and much more quickly if we want to avoid the top left and build a future for these people, let them live in peace. And the Europeans will have to invest in this as a project for their own future, not only of solidarity, for taking responsibility of what we have done in the past, even though other regions have behaved worse than Europe, and looking at a common future, which is the only way we can have in order to think of what will be happening after in the decades to come. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was a bit long.
Thank you. In parallel, simultaneously, I would say. I mean, if I would focus on Africa, I have few questions. Actually, I wouldn't expand. But first of all, if I look at Africa, you showed that there is an at the same time we see that they are not achieving in terms of the SDG and indicators. At the same time, they are not the ones responsible for the CO2 emission. Paradox there, in a sense that how do you expect a continent with little peace, with all wars means instabilities and tensions, social tensions, to achieve on a global goals like the SDGs? We are already in 2023, so 2030 is in 7 years, so it's even more or less a cycle. So credibly, do you think Africa would, I would say, move from this, I would say, situation it is in? Because as you know very well, I mean, when you are in wars, you need at least one cycle to reconstruct in one way or another way. That's one. But the wars is not only in Africa, but also in the Middle East. So the whole region is, from the east to the west, is surrounded by instabilities and destruction. But then at the same time, the climatic, and you showed in the first slides, the climatic extreme events are going up. And you said that you even stopped collecting the events. So it means that the frequency of the event is going up. So again, more destruction in terms of economic value. At the same time, the global I call it the global economic architecture, where Europe is part of it, EU is part of it, but also the US, China, and other countries. They are still in a dynamic of business as usual scenario of maybe 20 to 30 years before. So there is no really credible reflection on reform, of economic reform and financial reform, to move into what you proposed, responsibility on adaptation. So where are we heading? Just one question.
I don't have a crystal ball, but
yes, because tomorrow
the situation is not good. It's worsening. I mean, the events in Israel at the beginning and in Gaza to a much larger scale later are clearly destabilizing much of the Middle East and possibly some of Africa, unless something is done. The hope we can have is that the emergent countries, that the emerging powers that are to a largest extent China in particular and India, will play a stabilizing role, because they have everything to lose from instability and social civil war, social strain. China has invested a lot in Africa, and it would be important for them. They might have a say, and they might play a stabilizing role. India is becoming a global power really rapidly. So these two actors might play a stabilizing role. We have to hope that no instability shocks come from the United States after the elections of 2024, which might further aggravate the situation. And then hopefully the Africans themselves will be able to have their say if nothing else, because the largest contribution to demography in the world for the decades to come is coming from there. So they should have a voice. I don't know how they will manage to have a voice, but there will be hundreds of millions of people who, thanks to the dynamics of demography there, will have to emerge, and unfortunately will be facing a situation in which many of them will have to migrate. So the situation is not bad, is not good, it's not rosy. And we need to recover peace, because if we don't recover peace, everything is lost. War is losing. I mean, it's not by chance that Geoffrey Sachs, who is certainly an expert of the transition, the sustainable transition, and he is also an American, he is also a Jew, and he has publicly spoken against what it is being done in these last 2 months in Israel and in Palestine, which is outrageous.
Thank you, Giovanni. Any questions? Yeah, Yagane.
Thank you so much for this inspiring and eye-opening speech, and I learned a lot. But I have like a common question. So you were mentioning about the lakes disappearing and so on, a lot of natural disasters happening, and so you mentioned also the case of Iran. So that's the one I know better. And for me, it didn't happen just because of the climate change. It happened because of the mismanagement and the problem of governance, because the lake was there, and this is the biggest lake in Iran. And government they have contractors that build a dam, and even the contractors coming from China. So there's like a bribery happening by the Chinese to build it, and even the scientists just speak against of these dams before their constructions. It takes place. I mean, because it's a big project, there's a lot of money involved. So it's because of a lot of corruption that we have in these countries, and the problem of governance that we have. We have these natural disasters, and the lake was very unique in terms of the amount of salt it has and so on. So now the salt is there, and with the wind, we have deforestation, and also the arable land over there is disappearing. So the scale of the disaster is huge and enormous. So in these countries, one of the biggest problems at the end of the day is mismanagement, governance issues. And okay, at the end of your discussion, and also about the wars and so on, many of it, all of the conflicts, many of it come from the governance issues and the government's incapability to bring peace to the area. And so the role of the EU, you mentioned, okay, it's one of the roles that EU can play is to bring the technology and the finances to some sort to help these countries solve their issues. But probably I think one thing which is more even burning the problem is helping them with the governance problems. And what we have observed in the history that once we had the very critical moments, I mean, Western involvement in the countries was not in the good directions. It ended up with having most authoritarian regimes coming to power in the region and so on. So I think we also have to rethink the way we can contribute to bring better governance to the region, and what would be the role of the EU, because it's a global actor.
Thank you, Yagane. It's it's a very well taken point, and I will answer through telling the audience my personal experience rather than theory. When I started this master in management of sustainable development goals, of which I am the director, back in 2017, I mean, I started thinking about building human capital that would be supportive to the sustainable transition back in 2015, and this was a joint effort with Gramenos Mastroianni, who will come tomorrow, and unfortunately I will not be here because I have to fly back. What we had in mind was to create capabilities in managers who then have a role in multinational enterprises, the big companies, in order to reshape production processes in a sustainable way from inside, because there would be opportunities down the line. Now, contrary to my expectations, what the people we got in class were mostly from Africa. And not only from Africa, because we got 100 people who got our master diploma in the first 6 editions from 42 different countries. There is even one from Lebanon, by the way. None from Iran. But many of them are thinking, but what was wrong in our views? And it was not that it was wrong in our views, but the people from those countries, those few people that are not going to be there to take the bribes, are realizing how it is a matter of life or death to get those capabilities and bring them home. So after 6 editions, and the 7th edition is going to start soon, it is not going to change much, but I'm starting to, together with other people, my stakeholders, to think that what we need to do is directly restructure the program in a way that would build those capabilities that you were asking for. So my vision is that if we put European financing and local capabilities in place, we will be able to build a green wall to stop the desertification and maybe send the desert back. This is my vision. But I need people like you, like the stakeholders that will be in this conference, to help me, because I cannot do it by myself.
More questions? I don't know if we have a bit of more time. I have one question about, in fact, 2 developments that we've seen, and I wanted to have your views on that. Is there is a new concept now linked to accelerating the transition to more sustainability, more sustainable transition and green transition, whatever this means, is about the carbon sequestration and then the carbon economy. And I would like to understand a bit more whether these developments might be conducive to neutralizing or to reach the scenario of the carbon net carbon economy in 2050 or 2050 or 2060. But then at the same time, I see the risk that this is really extending the transition beyond the 2050. So what is your view on that? And how do you see also the European Union particularly as compared or vis-a-vis their partners, neighborhood in Africa and Middle East. Because there is a lot of debate about developing these projects of preservation, conservation, nature conservation, preservation of the biodiversity, and also putting a lot of effort on those carbon sequestration projects. So this can also, there has been discussion about greenwashing, because the majority of those projects are led by fossil fuel type of companies or other polluting companies who are buying credits in terms of carbon and all of this. So of course there is a carbon market in the European Union, which is working, but not working, as we would like, but it's working. But then how do you see this development in Mediterranean and Africa, and whether you think it is conducive to more sustainable development or sustainable transition or not?
Using market instruments if there are enough guarantees that it is not for doing speculative actions is good. We know that markets can help allocate the limited resources in a better way, and we have to believe to that. Otherwise, our training in economics was lost time. So provided that the process is well guided and it is not diverted towards carbon washing, it is a good idea to have a market that is perfectible. It could be improved, but still nowadays it helps. And because, what is the problem? If we want to, forgive me for dressing the cap of an economist for a few minutes. Of course, the problem with the side effects of the development that we had since the first industrial revolution in the UK until today was that we had wrong prices. And we economists tended to say, okay, but the externalities that are produced are really limited. And this was done until very recently. And if you go to or look at what was the environmental economics as it is taught, for instance, they usually start teaching the Kuznets curves, which tells you that, okay, you will be polluting, the environment will be damaged, but up to a certain point, after which the reverse relationship happens. You tend to become richer, but you move from the manufacturing to the third sector. There is less pollution. And at that point, we usually stop. I raise a further question to my students, and I ask, but where are the manufacturing industries going if they are disappearing from this country? and the issue is that it is just like playing the three cards game. There is this play in Naples. If you go there, don't ever try, because you lose money. And what happens is that we have contributed to a large extent to disseminate the idea that technological progress was solving everything. So I'm not against technology, and we should never be against technology, but we should always ask for technological accountability. Everything should be transparent, done in a transparent way. So if there is the ability to sequester the CO2, and that comes in as a very important technology, it's okay. This is going to help. But it should not be used as an excuse not to do other modifications in our behavior and things like that. So I believe that having a carbon market is good, because going back to the prices that did not incorporate the CO2 that was emitted, if you have that companies, firms have to compensate their CO2 emissions, as to the best of our knowledge, they are approximated. Even though the market is producing prices that are not exactly efficient, but at least in that balance sheet, there will be the impact. So it will be imputed what CO2 is doing in some ways. It is perfectible, but it is better than not having it. And at the end of the day, we will have to have prices that no longer have externalities excluded. All the externalities will have to be included one day.
Okay, thank you very much, Giovanni. I see Yagane with another question. Okay, but we need to have the break. So if it's really pressing, yes. Otherwise, you can discuss with Giovanni in the coffee break.
About data collection. And so
Okay,
on.
so
It's
yes,
okay.
yeah,
It's good.
yeah, very quickly.
Okay, so it's about data collection and evidence collection that we are so obsessed with it, in my point of view. Many argue that it's necessary, we should do it, and so on. But what I observed in the different meetings, I was in COP23 like last week, a Mediterranean COP, and what I saw, there was agreement on saving biodiversity protection. So having a list of species to be saved in the Mediterranean Sea and so on. And at some point, some countries said, okay, no, we disagree, like Tunisia, Algeria, and so on. And Europe had a problem with bond. And then Italy just said, okay, let's go and collect some more data and do economic analysis and so on, and then come back to this. My own impression is that we are so obsessed with data collection and things like that, that we use it as an excuse to putting our action-taking day a bit further. Like, how much evidence is enough? We all know that climate change is there. You say, okay, in your own perspective, this is not winter. Me the same, I feel it. Every one of us feel and touch it. There is so much evidence out there. There are also, like I was in another event and about data collection on the seas, and many mentioned that there is a lot of duplication of efforts in order to collect data, like the temperature of the sea and so on, by many organizations. How much evidence is enough for us to be strong enough to stand upon, like, lobbying companies and say, no, we don't want fossil fuels anymore, we don't want coal mining anymore, things like that?
There is no answer to this question, but I have to observe that this is another way to postpone decisions, and we should not fail prey of the idea that the state is against the well-being of the people, according to, if you wish, there was this old philosopher Hume that supposed that the best way was to avoid that the state intervenes, but the so-called Leviathan. But yet we need to have good faith at the table, at the negotiating table, because if you don't have that precondition, it's really difficult. So it's a mixture between rules and ethics. We need a lot of ethics, which has been taken out of the table, and we need to bring it back.
Yes, I think we have to integrate ethics everywhere, also in many disciplines. And this is something that I have the impression is not accepted by the mainstream, for example, even economics. So we need to continue working on this. And with this, I thank you very much, Giovanni, for this really enlightening and very comprehensive keynote speech for the conference. I think it gives us a good way to, think and trying really to produce some innovative thinking for all these societal challenges and crises that we are facing. I think our humanity facing. I mean, I sometimes I think that back then, in the time of the financial crisis, we said, okay, this is manageable, but these type of challenges that we have nowadays, alone, it cannot be managed at all. I mean, we need to have really global solidarity mechanisms and global agreements and regional agreements and trying really to work together to find solutions. So thank you very much. We have 15 minutes of coffee break outside, and then we resume at 15. So 4:15, we have the first session on regional integration global.